14 enemy planes closing in fast. A group of bombers leaking fuel and on fire. One pilot who threw out the rule book and told his crew to hang on tight. He was about to try something nobody had ever done in European skies. His fellow pilots thought he'd lost his mind. 5 minutes later, they were all still breathing, and the German Air Force had a terrifying new story to tell. Winter 1943 was brutal for every American airman based in England. Ice coated the windows, their breath fogged up inside oxygen masks. Down below, the English countryside vanished under thick December fog. Up above, thousands of bombers left white trails across the grey war sky. This was the peak of America's daylight bombing campaign. The 8th Air Force believed in bombing during the day with precision. They were confident their Norden bomb site could hit a tiny target from 20,000 feet up. The plan was simple. Waves of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers would fly over occupied Europe, destroy German factories and railways, and come home protected by their own powerful guns. Reality was much bloodier. German fighters attacked the bomber groups with deadly precision. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s would climb high, flip upside down, and dive straight at the formations at speeds over 500 miles per hour. This head-on attack became Germany's favorite tactic. It was brutal, effective, and terrifying. The bombers had no guns pointing forward. Their nose turrets had twin 50-caliber machine guns, but gunners only had seconds to aim and fire before the enemy planes flashed past. Most B-17s were shot down without ever hitting their attackers. The gunners knew it, the pilots knew it, the Germans knew it. By December, some missions lost over 20% of their planes. Entire squadrons disappeared over German cities. Crews flew their missions like prisoners counting days, knowing survival was unlikely. Into this hell came thousands of young Americans who'd never seen combat. Farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college dropouts, and factory workers who'd volunteered or been drafted. They learned how to fly in formation, manage oxygen, and fire guns through frozen gloves. But nobody taught them how to survive the head-on attack. There was no manual for that, just hope and luck. The 8th Air Force tried different strategies, tighter formations, different altitudes, fighter escorts when possible. But in late 1943, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings barely had enough fuel to reach the German border before turning back. The bombers flew alone over Germany, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. The noise was deafening and surreal. The roar of Wright's Cyclone engines at full power, the rattle of gun turrets turning, the crackle of radio calls reporting enemy positions, then the scream of diving fighters, the hammering sound of 20mm cannon fire punching through aluminum, the wet thud of bullets hitting flesh, and sometimes the terrible silence when an engine stopped or a wing broke off and a bomber began falling toward Earth. Into this nightmare flew First Lieutenant James Howard on his 23rd mission. James Howard didn't look like someone who'd revolutionize fighter tactics. He was quiet, disciplined, more of a thinker than a talker. Born in Canton, China in 1913 to missionary parents, he grew up surrounded by different languages and cultures. His father ran a medical mission. His mother taught school. Young Howard watched people solve problems with limited resources and no backup. He came back to America for college at Pomona studying pre-med. But flying called to him stronger than medicine. In 1937, he quit school and joined the Navy as a pilot trainee. He washed out, not because he couldn't fly, but because of a minor medical issue that kept him grounded. That could have been the end of his flying career. For most people, it would have been. Howard went to China. He joined the American Volunteer Group, the Flying Tigers, in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. Under Claire Chennault, he flew Curtiss P-40 Warhawks against Japanese bombers and fighters over Burma and southern China. The AVG fought outnumbered and outgunned. They had no spare parts, no backup, and no room for mistakes. Survival meant being clever, aggressive, and thinking ahead. Howard excelled. He learned to use the P-40's strengths, its diving speed, its toughness, its ability to take damage and keep flying. He learned to trick enemy fighters into bad positions, use the sun and clouds for cover, and never fight fair. In 6 months, he shot down 6 confirmed enemy planes and became one of the AVG's best pilots. When the Flying Tigers disbanded in mid-1942, Howard returned home and joined the Army Air Forces. He expected to go to the Pacific. Instead, he was sent to England as a fighter pilot with the 354th Fighter Squadron, part of the newly formed 355th Fighter Group. They flew P-51 Mustangs, sleek, long-range fighters that would become the war's most famous escorts. But in late 1943, the Mustang force was still small. The bombing campaign was at its peak, and losses kept mounting. Howard was older than most fighter pilots. At 30, he was a veteran among 22-year-olds. He didn't drink heavily or chase thrills. He studied mission reports. He asked questions. He thought about systems, how the enemy moved, how formations worked, where the weaknesses were. His squadron respected him, but didn't fully understand him. He was skilled, calm, and strangely fearless in a calculating way. He flew like someone solving a math problem in real time. On January 11, 1944, Howard was assigned to escort a bomber formation targeting German factories near Oschersleben, deep in central Germany. It was a maximum-range mission. The fighters would barely have enough fuel to reach the bombers, stay with them for a few critical minutes, and race back to England before their tanks ran dry. Howard took off in the freezing morning, joined his flight, and climbed toward the bomber stream. He had no idea that in less than an hour he'd be alone over Germany, facing a choice no training had prepared him for. The mission started falling apart 20 minutes from the target. Cloud cover thickened over the North Sea. Visibility dropped. Radio communication broke down as flights struggled to stay together. The bomber stream stretched out, lost its tight formation, and became vulnerable. Then the first German fighters appeared. They came in groups of 4 and 6, climbing out of the haze, positioning themselves ahead of the bombers. The Luftwaffe had perfected the art of interception. Fighters would climb above and ahead, roll upside down, and dive straight through the formation nose first. The closing speed gave gunners almost no time to react, and the concentrated fire, cannons and machine guns hitting one bomber, was often devastating. The P-51 escorts engaged. Dogfights erupted across the sky. Pilots broke formation to chase attackers or defend bombers under fire. Within minutes, the neat escort pattern dissolved into chaos. Howard's flight was pulled into a running fight with a group of Focke-Wulf 190s. He fired, maneuvered, and tried to stay between the enemy and the bombers, but the numbers were against him. There were too many Germans and too few escorts. Fuel was already a problem. Every minute of combat burned gallons they couldn't spare. Then Howard looked up and saw them. A formation of B-17s, about 30 bombers, separated from the main group and drifting west. They were alone, no other escorts in sight. Below them, climbing in a lazy spiral, were at least a dozen German fighters preparing to attack. Howard checked his fuel gauge. He checked his position. He tried to call his flight on the radio, just static. He scanned the sky for other P-51s. Nothing. The bombers had minutes, maybe less, before the first attack. If Howard turned back, he might make it home. If he engaged alone, he'd be outnumbered more than 10 to 1. Even if he survived the first pass, the Luftwaffe would swarm him the moment they realized he was the only defender. This wasn't a decision covered by doctrine. It wasn't a scenario from training. It was simple, brutal math. Abandon them or fight. Howard pushed the throttle forward and dove toward the bombers. The German fighters hadn't yet started their attack. They were still positioning, communicating, setting up the run. Howard knew he had one advantage: surprise. They didn't expect a lone Mustang to challenge an entire squadron. He closed the distance fast. The bombers grew larger in his windscreen. He could see the ball turrets rotating, the waist gunners tracking movement, the formation tightening instinctively. Then the first German flight peeled off and dove. Howard rolled hard, pulled lead, and fired. His tracer bullets cut through the air and clipped the wing of a Messerschmitt. The fighter broke off, trailing smoke. The others scattered. Confusion rippled through the German formation. One escort shouldn't have been a problem, but Howard wasn't flying like a typical escort. He flew like someone with nothing to lose and perfect understanding of geometry. The Luftwaffe reorganized. They came again and again, head-on passes, side attacks, slashing dives from above. Howard met each one with gunfire and maneuvering. He didn't try to dogfight, he didn't chase. He stayed close to the bombers and made himself the problem every German pilot had to solve before they could reach their targets. Then he did something nobody expected. He flew into the middle of the bomber formation. Fighter doctrine in 1943 was clear. Escorts stayed outside the bomber formation. They patrolled the flanks, the high cover, the approach routes. They intercepted enemy fighters before they reached the heavy bombers. Close escort was considered defensive, passive, and ineffective. Nobody flew inside the formation. The risk was too high. Bombers flew tight, wingtip to wingtip, with minimal room for error. Turbulence from propellers and slipstreams created invisible walls of disturbed air. A fighter caught in the wake could lose control, collide, or be shot down by friendly fire. Bomber gunners were trained to shoot at anything that moved within range, friend or foe. But Howard understood something the doctrine writers didn't. The German head-on attack depended on a clear run. The fighters needed a straight line, high speed, and an unobstructed field of fire. If a defending fighter positioned itself directly in front of the bombers, between the Germans and their targets, the attackers had two choices: break off or risk a head-on collision with an armed opponent at combined closure speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Howard slid his Mustang into the lead element of the bomber formation. He throttled back to match their speed. He flew just ahead of the lead B-17, low and centered, his fighter silhouetted against the sky. The bomber crews saw him. They didn't know what he was doing. Some thought he was lost. Others feared he'd been hit and was trying to crash land near the formation for rescue. A few gunners tracked him reflexively, fingers near triggers, waiting to see if he was friend or threat. Then the Germans came again. Two Messerschmitts diving from 11 o'clock high, nose on, cannons ready. They had a perfect angle. The bombers were locked in formation, unable to evade. The approach was textbook. But Howard was there. He held his position, waited until the last possible second, then fired a short burst and broke left. The lead German flinched, rolled, and pulled out of the dive. The second fighter followed. Neither pressed the attack. The risk was too high. The Mustang was in the way, and it was shooting. Howard climbed, rolled, and returned to the formation. He tucked himself back into the lead element, just ahead and slightly below. The bombers adjusted. The pilots understood now. He wasn't lost. He was a shield. The Germans regrouped. They tried side attacks. Howard met them from the side. They tried vertical dives. He climbed and forced them to overshoot. They tried coordinated runs from multiple angles. He pivoted, fired, and disrupted each one. The Luftwaffe wasn't retreating. They were persistent, skilled, and determined. But they were also constrained by physics and risk tolerance. Every pass Howard contested was a pass that failed, and every failed pass burned their fuel, morale, and time. The bomber gunners began to coordinate with him. They held fire when he maneuvered, giving him space. They called out threats over the radio. They watched his back and covered his blind spots. An unplanned, unspoken partnership emerged. 1 fighter and 30 bombers working together against an enemy that outnumbered them all. For 30 minutes, Howard fought alone. He burned through ammunition. He burned through fuel. He took hits, small caliber rounds that punched through his fuselage and missed critical systems by inches. His engine ran hot. His hands ached. His vision tunneled from adrenaline and oxygen debt. But the bombers held formation, and the Germans began to disengage. The moment Howard's fuel gauge dipped below reserve, the Luftwaffe broke off. It wasn't a retreat. It was calculation. The bombers were nearing the edge of the target zone. Allied fighters would return soon. The risk-reward ratio had shifted. The German fighters peeled away in pairs, diving toward lower altitude and disappearing into the cloud deck. Howard watched them go. He didn't chase. He had no fuel, no ammunition, and barely enough airspeed to stay aloft. He eased his Mustang out of the formation. The lead B-17 wagged its wings, a silent thank you. Howard returned the gesture, rolled level, and began the long glide back toward England. His engine coughed twice, fuel starvation. He adjusted the mixture, leaned it out as far as he dared, and coaxed another 10 minutes of power from a nearly empty tank. The English coast appeared through the haze. He crossed at 2,000 feet, too low for safety, too high to bail out. He landed at the first available field. The Mustang rolled to a stop. The engine died. Howard sat in the cockpit, silent, as ground crew ran toward him. They found bullet holes in the wings, tail, and fuselage. They found an engine that had been running on fumes and prayer. They found a pilot who had flown deeper into enemy territory, stayed longer under fire, and engaged more aircraft than any escort mission on record. But they didn't find a scratch on him. Howard climbed out, filed a brief combat report, and said little. He mentioned the bombers, the Germans, and the maneuver. He didn't embellish. He didn't claim heroics. He simply described what happened. The bomber crews told a different story. When they landed back at their bases in England, they debriefed with intelligence officers and recounted the mission. They described the lone Mustang that had stayed with them for half an hour. They described the pilot who had flown inside their formation, absorbed attacks meant for them, and turned himself into a moving roadblock against an entire German fighter group. The gunners estimated 14 separate enemy aircraft engaged. Some said more. All agreed on one thing. Without that pilot, they wouldn't have made it home. Word spread quickly. Within days, the story reached 8th Air Force headquarters. Commanders reviewed Howard's report, cross-referenced it with bomber crew testimony, and analyzed the tactical implications. What Howard had done violated protocol. It was reckless by the book, but it had worked. And in a war where bomber losses were crippling morale and operational capacity, results mattered more than orthodoxy. In April 1944, James Howard was awarded the Medal of Honor. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The citation praised his courage, skill, and selfless devotion to the bomber crews under his protection. But the citation didn't mention the most important thing. Howard hadn't fought out of blind heroism. He'd fought out of logic. He'd seen a problem, analyzed the variables, and executed a solution no manual had predicted. He'd turned himself into a weapon, not through firepower, but through positioning. He'd understood that presence, not kills, was the key to disruption. And in doing so, he'd revealed a flaw in German tactics that nobody had exploited before. The head-on attack had been the Luftwaffe's most effective weapon against American daylight bombers. It relied on speed, shock, and the bombers' lack of forward firepower. But it also relied on a psychological truth. Escorts stayed outside. Fighters protected bombers from a distance. They didn't get in the way. Howard proved that assumption wrong. Within weeks of his mission, the 8th Air Force began training escort pilots in close-in defensive tactics. The idea wasn't to replicate Howard's lone stand. That was unsustainable and suicidal by design, but to incorporate elements of his positioning strategy into coordinated escort doctrine. Fighters began flying tighter to the bombers. They positioned themselves along the attack routes most likely to be used by German fighters. They didn't wait for threats to develop. They preempted them. The mere presence of a fighter in the path of a head-on run forced German pilots to hesitate, adjust, or abort. Loss rates began to decline. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't the only factor. The introduction of long-range P-51 escorts, improved formation tactics, and losses among Luftwaffe pilots all played roles. But the shift in fighter positioning, the willingness to get closer, accept risk, and disrupt rather than simply intercept, became a permanent feature of escort operations for the rest of the war. Bomber crews noticed the change. They felt safer. They flew with more confidence. And they spoke of Howard's mission as proof that one pilot in the right place at the right time could alter the course of a battle. The Germans noticed too. Intelligence reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots mentioned American fighters that refused to leave the bombers, that stayed close even under fire, and that made coordinated attacks far more difficult. The tactic didn't stop German interceptions, but it reduced their effectiveness. And in a war of attrition, that was enough. Howard returned to combat. He flew additional missions, trained new pilots, and continued to refine his approach. He wasn't a natural self-promoter. He didn't give interviews or seek recognition. He flew, fought, and survived. By the end of the war, he'd been credited with 6 aerial victories in the European theater on top of his 6 with the Flying Tigers. His official tally was modest compared to some aces, but numbers alone didn't measure his impact. He'd shown that courage without logic was noise, and logic without courage was theory. Only together could they change the outcome. James Howard survived the war. He stayed in the Air Force, rose to the rank of Brigadier General, and retired in 1966 after nearly 30 years of service. He lived quietly in Florida, far from the spotlight, and rarely spoke publicly about the mission that earned him the Medal of Honor. When asked about it in later years, he'd say only that he did what the situation required. He didn't call it heroism, he called it problem-solving. He saw bombers in danger, saw a gap in the defenses, and filled it. The fact that it worked, he said, was as much luck as skill. But those who flew with him disagreed. They saw a man who'd trained himself to think under fire, stay calm when chaos ruled, and act decisively when others would have hesitated. They saw someone who understood that war wasn't won by following rules. It was won by knowing when to break them. The maneuver Howard used that day, flying inside the bomber formation to disrupt head-on attacks, was never officially codified. It was too dangerous, too dependent on individual judgment, and too easy to misapply. But it lived on in the oral tradition of fighter tactics. Instructors told the story, pilots debated it, and in the decades that followed, variations of the concept appeared in air combat doctrine around the world. Howard's legacy wasn't a single tactic, it was a mindset. The understanding that air combat wasn't about bravery alone, but about geometry, timing, and the willingness to occupy the space where the enemy least expected you. In the vast library of World War II aviation history, his name appears less often than it should. He wasn't flashy, he didn't accumulate a high score, he didn't fit the stereotype of the swaggering ace. But the bomber crews who made it home on January 11th, 1944, knew what he'd done, and they carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. Some named their sons after him. Some wrote letters thanking him decades after the war. Some simply told the story again and again to anyone who would listen. Because in a war that consumed millions, James Howard reminded them that one person in one moment could still tip the balance, not through firepower, not through luck, but through the rare combination of clarity, courage, and the refusal to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. He died in 1995 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by veterans, fellow pilots, and men who'd flown in bombers over Germany 50 years before. They didn't speak of tactics or doctrine. They spoke of the day a lone Mustang stayed when every logical reason said to leave. And they spoke of the lesson he left behind, that the most powerful weapon in war isn't the machine, but the mind that dares to use it differently.